All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So first off, hello and welcome to today's Altero sponsored webinar on licensing Microsoft Server in virtual environments. I'm Andy Serwich. I'm kind of going to be acting as the moderator today, and with me is Thomas Maurer. Hey, Thomas.
Hey, Andy.
So, Microsoft licensing definitely is a kind of a complicated topic, and more so when we bring virtualization into the mix. And really kind of the focus of our webinar today is to provide some general information and some examples on Microsoft licensing and virtualization. So, kind of to go over our agenda for the day, we're going to do some introductions on Thomas and myself and Altero, and then we're going to get into the real meat and potatoes of the webinar, the actual licensing presentation that's going to be put on by Thomas. He's going to cover some example scenarios as well, and then when we're all done with that, we're just going to kind of do a real brief, couple-minute overview of Altero Hyper-V Backup. It's a nice piece of software that is created by Altero, and then we're going to have time for some Q&A. Really, if you have any questions during the the entirety of the webinar, kind of hold them to the end. We're going to have a section for Q&A at the end, and we'll definitely get to your questions. And then we're going to wrap things up and go from there, and hopefully we'll all have a good time today. So, kind of some introductions first. Again, my name is Andy Serwich. I'm a Hyper-V MVP, kind of been in the industry for a couple of years. I work on a lot of different things, VMware, Linux, network security, but really my primary focus is Microsoft virtualization technologies, cloud support design, and the Windows Server stack. And like I said, we've also got Thomas Maurer here today. You want to do a quick introduction of yourself, Thomas?
Yeah, sure, why not? Thanks, Andy. My name is Thomas Maurer. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Hyper-V. I work as a cloud architect for a company called ITnetics, which is a consulting and engineering company located in Switzerland. We are focused on Microsoft technology and basically on Microsoft Cloud solutions based on Microsoft System Center, Hyper-V, Windows Storage, and of course Microsoft Azure as well.
Great. Thank you for that. So, real quick introduction on our webinar sponsor today, Altero Software. They make a real great Hyper-V backup product, just simply called Altero Hyper-V Backup. And, it focuses on, real quick and easy backup and restore operations on Hyper-V VMs, easy to use, very fast, and the price point is great. It's very full-featured, very powerful software for an affordable price, and we all like free, right? So the first two VMs are free, so that's always a plus. And the support is outstanding. The guys over at support just do a great job in supporting the product. So definitely encourage everyone to check it out. You got a 30-day free trial and a free edition available for download right there, altero.com/hypervbackup.
Perfect. So let's get started with the licensing webinar. We will take a quick overview. This presentation of this webinar is based on the ebook Altero released on their website. So if you want to go and download it later on, go to the website altero.com and you can find that ebook, which includes all and a little bit more information from this webinar. So let's start first with a quick overview about Hyper-V, or of the history of Hyper-V. So back in I think it was 2003, Microsoft acquired a company called Connectix, which were building products like Virtual PC and Virtual Server, which were then included into the Microsoft portfolio. And in 2008, Microsoft introduced the first version of Hyper-V as a role of Windows Server 2008. A little bit later in this year, they also released a download or a software called Hyper-V Server 2008, which is basically a stripped-down version of Windows Server, which only includes all the features you need to run Hyper-V. A lot of people don't know about this version, but it's basically a free version of Hyper-V, which includes all the features you can have right now. It's like clustering, live migration, all that things are included in that. But we will talk a little bit more about that later. And in 2009, Microsoft did a huge step forward with Windows Server 2008 R2. They included a lot of new stuff which were really important at this time. Simple stuff like clustering with clustered shared volumes, live migration, and a lot of performance and scalability improvements. In 2011, Microsoft released then Service Pack 1, which brought a lot of basically two new features called dynamic memory and remote FX, which were basically supporting VDI scenarios if you run VDI scenarios on top of Hyper-V. And then in 2012, Microsoft released Windows Server 2012 and Hyper-V Server 2012. Again, a huge step forward in terms of virtualization. They brought a lot of scalability improvements, added new features in terms of storage, network virtualization, or Hyper-V replica. And then last year, in 2008 R2, Microsoft did improve those features and brought that to market. So let's see a little bit about the host scale. So I have this slide in there. As you can see, when I talk, it was a huge step. What we can do right now, and if you look at Windows Server 2008 R2 and Windows Server 2012, we can see the improvements and the numbers in terms of scale. So the same numbers apply to Windows Server 2012 R2, so basically they didn't really improve those numbers, but I think for most people these numbers are already high enough like for the future. Why I add this slide here, that's really important to me, is that you can see there is only one version of Hyper-V. So every single, even if you use Standard Edition, Enterprise, Data Center, whatever you're using, you get the same things in 2012. So you get this 4 terabytes of RAM, this 1 terabyte inside the virtual machine, all that kind of thing. So there's no, even if you use other versions, there's no difference in scaling, right? So to cover a little bit the history, we can talk about the software versions or the editions we had in 2008 R2. So you can see that we had a lot of editions, different kind of editions in Windows Server 2008 R2, like the Foundation, Standard, Web Server, Enterprise Data Center, and whatever. There were even more, but they didn't really weren't really important now for the Hyper-V thing. So you can see we have the Standard, Enterprise, and Data Center, which allowed you to run Hyper-V, but they had some differences in there. For example, Standard did not support clustering and things like that. In 2012 and in 2012 R2, things got a lot easier. So as you can see again, and this is the important part, there is no real gap, so you can still use the maximum 4 terabyte RAM. And all versions of Hyper-V now support clustering, so even if you run the free edition, this Hyper-V server, you can do all the things with Hyper-V you would expect, like live migrations and clustering. You can also see kind of the differences here. In Windows Server 2012 and 2012 R2, there is no feature gap between the editions except for the Hyper-V server, which only runs Hyper-V related workloads or features. But that doesn't really care if you do that for Hyper-V, you can still do the same thing. The only difference here is Hyper-V server, for example, does only come in Server Core Edition, and you don't get the full UI you get with Standard and Data Center Edition. And the real difference here is licensing. So with the Standard Edition, you get the right to deploy one host and 2 virtual machines on top of that. With the Data Center Edition, you get 1 host and unlimited number of virtual machines with Data Center on top of that. And with Hyper-V Server, for example, you don't really get any licenses for virtual machines. So what's the point of Hyper-V Server? So for example, if you run Linux or Unix workloads on top of your Hyper-V environment, you probably want to use this SKU because then you don't have to pay anything to Microsoft because Hyper-V basically is free. So let's have a quick look at the additions here. We will cover like the interesting parts here are the licensing part. So that's a licensing webinar. So we will cover Windows Server 2012 R2 Standard and Data Center. So as I said, with Standard, you get these 2 virtual the license for 2 virtual instances or 2 virtual guests. And so basically you buy a Windows Server 2012 R2 Standard license for 1 physical box with 2 CPU sockets. So if you have 4 CPU sockets. I'm not talking about CPU cores, I'm talking about sockets. So if you have 4 physical processors in your system, you would need 2 versions of Windows Server Standard to run that system, even if you run only 1 virtual machine. With Data Center, it's the same thing. You buy a Data Center license for a physical box with the maximum of 2 physical processors or physical sockets, and then you can deploy unlimited virtual machines. If you have a server with 4 or more physical sockets, you have to buy more Data Center licenses again. So some slides ago I said that there is no real feature gap between Windows Server Standard and Data Center, and this was true for 2012, but there is one feature which doesn't make my slide correct. There's a new feature called Automated Virtual Machine Activation, which is only included in Data Center, in the Data Center edition. And what automatic virtual machine activation allows you to do is it allows you to activate virtual guests if the host is already activated. So basically you install your Windows Server 2012 R2 Data Center Hyper-V host, you activate that, however you do that, in the internet or KMS, whatever, and then if you deploy a virtual machine, a Windows Server 2012 virtual machine, this can be standard or Data Center, this virtual machine checks during the startup if the host is activated, and if the host is activated, the guest activates itself, and it won't check that until the guest reboots or after 7 days. So even if you move the virtual machine with a live migration to another host, the VM will still run and be activated until 7 days later, and it will recheck if the Hyper-V host is still activated. So this is a really great feature. It automatically activates all the virtual machines running on top of your Data Center hosts. Okay, let's cover some special things here before we get to the examples where we talk about a little bit more about the different scenarios you can get. So in basic understanding, licensing transfers. So a license, if you buy a license, it's always bound to a piece of hardware. So if you buy a standard license and install that on a physical box, and you want to replace that box, you have to wait at least 90 days until you can move that license to other hardware. And after that, you still again have to wait to the other 90 days to move that. There are probably other rules for other software products from Microsoft, but this is how it works for Windows Server. Okay, the next thing, the next really important thing, and that's basically the thing you have to think about. So we know that Windows Server Standard comes with 2 virtual licenses. So if I have a box with 2 physical CPUs, for example, or 2 physical sockets, and I want to run 2 virtual machines, I buy 1 standard edition. Now, if I want to run a 3rd or 4th virtual machine on top of that, I don't really have to purchase Data Center Edition. I could do that, but I can also buy a 2nd Standard Edition license, and I get then like 2 more licenses, so I could run 4 virtual machines on that physical host. The same thing here is true. This license is also bound to the hardware, so I have 2 licenses bound to the same hardware. And the same rule applies here, the 90-day rule. So if I cannot move both licenses to another host in those 90 days. So now this would make it really easy for clusters, right? But there is this rule that a license, again, is bound to a specific piece of hardware. So if I run a Hyper-V cluster, let's say I run that with 4 virtual machines. I have 2 hosts, both running Standard Edition, both nodes are capable of running 4 virtual machines. So I cannot just buy 2 Windows Server Standards licenses. I have to buy 2 licenses per host, because every host can run up to 4 virtual machines. So in total, this would make 4 4 Windows Server Standard licenses, right? So, but we will see a little bit more about that in the example, which should make it a little bit more clear. Other considerations. So if you're using volume license, you get a downgrade and down addition rights. So this means if you buy Windows Server 2012 R2, or you have the right to use Windows Server 2012 R2. You could also use Windows Server 2012 if you need that for some kind of a scenario where probably software is not compatible with the OS, with the latest OS. If you run any other role which is not really part of Hyper-V on the management OS, on the Hyper-V server, which, by the way, you probably shouldn't do, because a Hyper-V server should be a Hyper-V server and nothing else. But you could run, for example, in a standard license, you could run Hyper-V, and you could also install for an IIS web server on the physical box at the same time. In that case, you need 1 license for the physical box. So if you run if you bought a standard license, one of those virtual instant licenses will go to the physical box, and you can only deploy 1 virtual machine on top of that Hyper-V host. So, but this is really something you shouldn't really get into, because you should have a clean Hyper-V host, and you shouldn't do that. But in small environments, something like this is possible. For desktop operating systems, if you do VDI, for example, there are other rules. So you have to buy. They are not really covered by the server licenses. In that case, you probably wouldn't buy a Windows Server license. You probably would go for the free Hyper-V server and buy those desktop licenses, the special VDI desktop licenses. A feature I already talked about, automated virtual machine activation. This is very useful for service providers. So in a company scenario, your virtual machines probably get activated by a KMS server or something like that, or can connect to the internet to get activated. If you're a service provider and you're doing infrastructure as a service, you probably don't have access in the network of your customers, or the customer does not allow internet access, so your virtual machine cannot really activate. So if you're using this feature, automated virtual machine activations, VMs get activated even if they don't have internet or network access. And the next thing is Hyper-V Replica. So if you're using Hyper-V Replica, you have to have a license for the source virtual machine, or the main virtual machine, and you also have to have a license for on the replica host as well, except you're running software assurance, as you can see. So let's go to some example scenarios here. We covered them. They're also in this ebook, but it should make it probably a little bit more clear. So the first one is a pretty easy one. I have a Windows server. I have a physical box. I have 2 sockets, as you can see, and I'm running Windows Server 2012 R2 Standard Edition. Now I want to create 7 guest licenses. So what I can do here is I can buy 4 standard licenses. This would make 8 virtual licenses for 8 licenses for virtual machines. So in that case, I'm fine with this 4 licenses, and I even have 1 spare guest license, so I could deploy 8 virtual machines on that host. If I go to the next scenario, as you can see here, I have basically the same scenario. The only difference here, I have 4 physical CPUs. So in this scenario, I have to buy 8 Windows Server 2012 R2 standard licenses, and then you can still have 1 spare here again. this scenario is the thing I told you about, which is probably not that common, but still I have this physical box, two physical CPU sockets, and I'm running 7 guest OSs on top of that. So what I need here is 4 Windows Server 2012 R2 standard licenses. But since I have installed some kind of a backup software or a file share on the physical box, and I'm using that physical box not only for Hyper-V, I'm also using that as a file server. I need one of those 8 licenses I normally get, so I don't have any spare license left in that case. Okay, number 4 here. This is probably the easiest example. So if I have a Windows Server 2012 R2 data center host with 2 sockets, I want to run a standard edition of Windows Server. I can do that even if I have a data center license. I'm also allowed to run standard edition. I can also create data center editions. I can create so many VMs as I want, but the important part here is that I can also downgrade the edition, for example, to standard. So let's go to clustering. This is the example. I have a 2-node cluster. Each physical node has 2 physical CPUs. And I want to run 13 guests with Windows Server standard in there. What I need now, what I can do, I can not only buy like 7 licenses for one server or for both servers. So I have to buy 7 licenses for each of the physical boxes. So this would make a total of 14 Windows Server 2012 R2 standard licenses. Or the other thing I could do is buy 2 Windows Server data center licenses, 1 for each host. So I would have unlimited virtual machines. So this is the important part here, because even if one host goes down, all of the virtual machines can run on the other host, and I cannot control it. So this would mean I have to buy a lot of licenses for both hosts. And of course the same thing applies if I add a third host. Even this third host could run all the virtual machines. So this would mean I need 21 Windows Server 2012 R2 standard licenses or 3 data center licenses to run all that, to run that scenario correctly, because all the virtual machines could run on one physical box. In this scenario, this is 13. This could be also 14, of course, because you have this spare license left in this scenario. And now you probably think about, oh, this is really hard. I mean, this is like a lot of money I have to spend on licenses. But this is basically the same thing if you run VMware vSphere or any other virtualization solution. Since you're only licensing the guests, it doesn't really matter which hypervisor you're using. This counts for all the guest VMs at the same scenario. So if you're doing a VMware vSphere cluster with 2 physical boxes, the licensing looks exactly the same as we would run Windows Server Standard or Data Center Edition. You have to license the guest OS systems. That's the important part here. And of course, as I said, even if you would install Hyper-V servers, which doesn't really come with guest OS licenses, you still have to buy licenses. It doesn't really matter what you install on the physical box. It really matters what you install inside those virtual machines. So in this scenario, again, if I want to run 13 virtual machines with standard edition, I have to buy 2 data center licenses or 14 standard licenses to run all those virtual machines. To spin that up a little bit, in that case, I have 3 hosts running Hyper-V Server 2012 R2. They're all clustered. So I can have, I want to run 20 Windows Server standard license, I want to run 7 Windows 2012 R2 data center licenses. In that case, I cannot just buy standard licenses. I also have to buy data center licenses for the data center edition VMs. And in that case, I just need 3 data center licenses on that host, right? Even if I install Windows Server Hyper-V, the free edition. Okay, the next one here is I have this mix between Windows Server licenses and also client licenses. In that scenario, the client licenses are like are licensed separately. So I get this license for the client, but I still need to license the servers. So in that case, I would need 5 data center licenses for those servers, Windows Server Standard and Windows Server Data Center VMs I host on my systems. Okay, then we have some special scenarios here, like the last 2 examples. So if I'm running a physical environment with 3 hosts in that case, and I install Hyper-V Server 2012 R2, and I'm only running Ubuntu guests or 6 Ubuntu guests, I don't have to pay any licenses to Microsoft. As I said, you're only licensing the virtual machines. So if you don't run Windows Server virtual machines, you can use the free Hyper-V servers and don't pay any license at all. But you still get, of course, the full support from Microsoft if you're running Hyper-V Server. And the last example here is that you have a mix of, again, you have 3 physical hosts and you have a mix of guest operating systems from Ubuntu and Windows Server in that case. So what you have to license here is you have to license the Windows Server Standard Edition with 1 license per host, but you don't have to buy any other license for those Ubuntu virtual machines. So you can mix that up. You only have to license the Windows Server virtual machines here. Okay. So let's go to a quick summary, what I just told you. One thing which isn't on that list is the license stacking. That's probably the most important part. So you have this 2 edition. You have Windows Server Standard and Data Center. Standard gives you the right to install 2 virtual machines on top of your physical box, and Data Center allows you to install unlimited virtual machines on your physical box. Both editions are licensed per 2 sockets. So if you have more than 2 sockets, you have to buy more licenses as well. All the features which come with Hyper-V, even clustering, live migration, or like let's say 1 terabyte RAM per virtual machine, or 64 virtual CPUs per virtual machines are included of all the editions. So there's no feature gap except for this automated virtual machine activation I told you about, but there's no feature gap between those editions. You can do everything. There's not like other the competitors, what the competitors are doing. They do, for example, in smaller editions, they do not include all the features. So, but if you're running Hyper-V, you always get the full feature set. You have this Hyper-V Server 2012 R2, which is free. As I said, Hyper-V is free. What you pay for are the guest licenses. And if you're running a service provider, or if you're running your data center, check out Automated Virtual Machine Activation. This is pretty cool. It's very easy to set up. You basically just install your data center host, activate that host, however you do that, KMS, internet activation, whatever. And then when you deploy a virtual machine, you use that Automated Virtual Machine Activation key, which you can get from the TechNet website, and you deploy the virtual machine with that key, and then basically it's all done. So that's what a bit about the licensing part. start, let's give it back to Andy.
Yeah, definitely some good stuff there, Thomas. Appreciate you taking that through us. And just for me personally, I think the examples section is definitely helpful just to see the different scenarios. So that was definitely some good stuff. So with that said, we're going to do just a real quick couple-minute overview of Hyper-V Backup, product made by Altero. It's one of their main product sets here, specifically designed to back up virtual machines that are hosted on top of Hyper-V. As I said earlier, the backup and restore operations are quick and easy, no hassle, simple, quick, and easy to set up. I mean, you can do a backup, set up a backup in about 5 clicks. I don't know many other backup vendors that can do that. So, from a configuration standpoint, that's definitely nice. It works with Server 2012 R2, 2012, 2008 R2, and Server Core as well. And instead of, you don't just get full VM backups and restores. You can get really, really granular as well with file level and exchange level backups and restores as well. So definitely when you don't want to restore the whole VM, you can do just a granular file or exchange level backup too. So you got very low resource requirements as well, and it's fully Hyper-V aware. Does all the complex configuration connections for you. Again, kind of reiterating bullet point 2 there, where it's simple, quick, and easy to set up. And one of my personal favorite pieces of the software is it's fully Hyper-V cluster and CSV compatible. It sees those cluster shared volumes and the SMB 3.0 clusters with no issues at all. So definitely a full-featured piece of software. This screenshot just kind of shows you the dashboard of the application. This is really your one-stop shop for everything backup and restore related. You can see your backup drive status, total backup size per day. Those graphs are changeable as well to different metrics if you want, and you got a nice little history of your backups as well. So a lot of information right on one page. Again, kind of back to the powerful and simple, easy to use idea. So a little bit more information here. You can watch a 10-minute product demo at altero.com/demo. Just kind of covers the highlights of the application and everything that the application does for you. You can also download a free 30-day trial, or the free version from altero.com/hypervbackup. So we set aside some time for some Q&A. We did have a couple of questions come in during Thomas's presentation. So I'm just going to kind of cover those one at a time here, starting with the first one we got. I got a question here about multiple licenses when using the Windows Server Standard licensing. So if you've got 4 virtual machines, you need to have 2 licenses of Standard. But the question is, do I need to insert that license inside the OS of the host? And they say that because I know that I can move inside only 1 license and not multiple. Can you speak to that, Thomas?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, that's a very good question. Basically what you have to do, the license is more like a virtual license. So you only activate the server with 1 license key. That's absolutely correct. But you have to put that license somewhere away. So if Microsoft checks for that, you have to show them that you have 2 licenses. It's not a software thing, so if you don't enter a second licenses, you're not restricted to that. It's not like the operating system or Hyper-V is counting the licenses you have entered or something. You could also cheat, of course, and deploy like 1,000 virtual machines on a standard server without having those licenses. Of course, don't do that because you're not allowed to do that, but there is no software limitation and you don't have to enter a second key there, but you have to buy that license.
Okay, good deal. The next 2 questions we have I think are kind of the same thing. Really the question is, if backup software is installed on the host, so you got a third-party piece of software installed on the host machine, how many licenses are needed when you want to run 2 virtual machines on top of the host?
So it depends on this is a tricky question, because if you're running a backup software like an Agent or something, you don't need an extra license. But if you run the backup software, you install the backup product on the Hyper-V host. In that case, you would need one license for the host itself, and then with the standard edition, you would get one VM. So you would, if you want to run two virtual machines, you would have to buy another standard licenses. So the answer would be you would have to buy two standard licenses.
Okay, good deal. So we got a couple more here. Let me just kind of going through the list. So those were third party. What about licensing with Replica? Hyper-V Replica specifically.
Perfect. Yeah, the Hyper-V Replica part is it's like you have to license, of course, the source virtual machine or the running virtual machine, but you also have to have a license on the replica side. So it's basically, if you run replica of a virtual machines, these are basically two virtual machines in that case. So you have to license the source as well as the replica or the target, however you want to call it.
Okay. I got a question here by Albert here about failover to other hardware. I'm guessing kind of in that clustering scenario in regards to licensing. Kind of covered that a little bit with the standard licensing. You want to touch back on that real quick, Thomas?
If the question was about how if the hardware fails and I have to move the license to other hardware to a new hardware system or new hardware piece, as again this is this 90-day hardware rule. If you talk about failover in a cluster, as I said, this is pretty really hard scenario. So in that case, as you license inside a cluster, every host inside the cluster must have the maximum or has to have the licenses for the maximum virtual machine he is running. So in case if you have a 2-node cluster, for example, and you're running 8 virtual machines, these 8 virtual machines can run on the first host, and they can also run on the second host at the same time, or as they can all run on the second host, or they can all run on the first host. So you have to have a license for 8 virtual machines on every host. In that case, that would mean 4 standard licenses for the first host to get that 8 virtual machines, and 4 standard licenses for the second host to get that 8 virtual machines on the second host. So it's not it's not counting them together. It's like for every host you have to have this amount of licenses.
Perfect.
I hope I covered that.
Yeah, and Albert did have kind of a follow-up question to that. What if it's not like an automatic failover? It's only a disaster situation. I think the question is about kind of the 90-day license migration idea. Yeah.
Normally, I mean, I don't hope a disaster really strikes inside during this 90 days. But if it does, basically what you have to do is you have to buy another license, even still, because the license is still attached to that hardware. So you still have to go through that and buy this license, buy this other hardware for the second hardware you have to replace that.
Okay. Probably just cover, we got time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions here, but this particular question here by Norman, this is a question that I get asked a lot personally is, when you have like a standard license key, exactly how do you activate the guest VMs? You install the license key on the host, but the question is, do you use that same license key for the guest VMs as well?
Yeah, absolutely. If you're not using like KMS, or if you're not using automated virtual machine activation, where we have special keys for that, you're going to use the same key for that. Yeah.
Okay. And probably one more question. What I get asked a lot is, most businesses want to be real cost effective with their money, right? And at what number of virtual machines does it become more cost effective to license with data center licensing as opposed to using standard licensing?
Perfect question. I really expected that question. This is hard to say because the license costs are not always the same, so there is no fixed price for that. There is, if you, for example, have an enterprise agreement, or if it also depends on in which region you're living or you're working in. It depends on what time of the year it is for Microsoft as well. So the licenses really depend on the prices really depend on different kind of things. So, but normally what I can see, and correct me here, Andy, if there is if you can see something else, but I can see that that can make sense between running 8, 10, or 12 virtual machines, somewhere around that number. So between 8 and 12 virtual machines, that could be interesting to go to data center. But correct me here if you have seen something different.
That sounds about right, because most of the clustering scenarios that I've run into, it tends to be kind of a 2 or 3 node cluster, and I mean obviously the more hosts you have, the more your data center licensing is. So I mean not every case is black and white. You kind of have to take your own personal situation into account. Well, perfect. That is the end of our Q&A. Those questions that we didn't get to, we'll respond to via email. In the next day or two here, and other than that, I think we're pretty much wrapped up here with the Q&A. Again, thank you for attending. If you want any more information on Altero or licensing, be sure to check out altero.com for the product, and we do have an ebook on this same topic written by Eric Siren, one of our altero.com bloggers. And you can download that at altero.com/Hyper-V, which will put you right on Altero's Hyper-V Hub, which is a blog about all things Hyper-V and Microsoft virtualization. Again, thanks for attending, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.